Greetings. I'm Pastor Gigi Sikkonen. Today we begin a new worship series for the Lenten season, and the title of this series is I Am, Meeting Jesus. And it's a look at the different identities of Jesus as we seek to understand just a bit better who this Jesus is that we as Christians claim to follow. We begin our season with this story from Matthew chapter 4, verses 1 through 11, and it's the story of the temptation of Christ. Here it is from the Common English Bible. Then the Spirit led Jesus up into the wilderness so that the devil might tempt him. After Jesus had fasted for 40 days and 40 nights, he was starving. The tempter came to him and said, "Since you are God's Son, command these stones to become bread." Jesus replied, "It's written, people won't live only by bread, but by every word spoken by God." After that, the devil brought him into the holy city and stood him at the highest point of the temple. He said to him, "Since you are God's Son, throw yourself down, for it is written, I will command my angels concerning you, and they will take you up in their hands so that you won't hit your foot on a stone." Jesus replied, "Again, it is written, don't test the Lord your God." And then the devil brought him to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their glory. He said, "I'll give you all these if you bow down and worship me." Jesus responded, "Go away, Satan, because it is written, you will worship the Lord your God and serve only him." The devil left him, and angels came and took care of him. Friends, hear what the Spirit is saying to God's people. Christians understand themselves to be followers of Christ. So we are going to spend this Lenten season leading up to until Easter looking at who this Jesus is that we claim to follow. And hopefully this will help us grow in our own discipleship. Today's scripture, the story of the temptation, I think tells us quite a few things about Jesus. And let me hit the highlights very quickly. We read that Jesus is someone led by the Spirit, even if it's into the wilderness. We read that Jesus is the Son of God. We gather from the dialogue that Jesus is well versed in Scripture. We see that Jesus is clear about his mission, because he doesn't give in to these various temptations to deviate from it. And in the end, at the end of our story, Jesus is cared for by angels, which I think is a lovely last sentence in today's scripture. I should say that our in-person worship will be celebrating our intergenerational worship, and as part of that, my practice is to provide a little bit of context and framing, and then give people various questions to explore through different stations and activities during our time together. I'm going to do something similar for us online. So I'm going to provide just a little framing, and mostly I'm going to give you some questions to think about this week. So in terms of context, this story takes place, at least in Matthew's Gospel, it takes place after Jesus' baptism and before Jesus moves to Galilee and calls the first disciples. The very first couple of lines of this story are very challenging for me. It says that Jesus was led by the Spirit into the wilderness so that he might be tempted by the devil. That sentence should raise some pretty deep theological questions. Does God tempt us? And I struggle to agree with that, and yet I'm reminded the Lord's Prayer. Think about that line in the Lord's Prayer that says, "Lead us not into temptation." So that's a question you could ponder this week. How do you feel about that? Does God tempt people or not? Or do we do enough of that on our own, right? The second thing I notice is that this story the lead into this story is that Jesus is in the wilderness for 40 days. And there are a lot of biblical connections that we can make with the 40 days part of our story. Moses, for example, Moses was on Mount Sinai for 40 days. The Israelites wandered in the desert for 40 years. Our Lenten season is a season of 40 days, not counting Sundays, leading up to Easter. And for Jesus, the 40 days was a time of fasting, and that invites us to consider the question, is there a type of fast, and I use that term pretty broadly, is there something we need to disconnect from in our own lives so that we might connect more closely with God during this season? And that's a question you could ponder this week if you haven't already made some sort of Lenten commitment. I know some people will fast perhaps from social media, or if you have more of an environmental bent, another option is to be more conscious of something like your use of plastic. There are many ways one can observe a Lenten fast that goes beyond abstaining from a favorite food, for example. So when we think about the wilderness, I think an interesting question is, what did Jesus do in the wilderness for 40 days? What does one do in the wilderness for 40 days? And was this time in the wilderness, was it part of the temptation, right? He was without food. Or was this a time of grounding, a time of preparation for the encounter with the devil? There are no easy answers to those questions, but there's some you can explore this week. In the dialogue portion of today's scripture, there are some interesting things to notice. Our translation from the Common English Bible uses the phrase, "since you are God's son." Some translations pose it as more of a question, "if you are God's son." I think the temptation in many ways was about Jesus being clear about his mission and how he would go about that during his time on earth. There was this temptation when he was extremely hungry to turn stones into bread. And while Jesus performed many miracles, particularly around food, his ministry was about more than miracles. Then there is this temptation to safety and comfort, if you will, to have the angels protect Jesus. And while Jesus showed up in ways that showed great compassion and care for people, his ministry was about more than promising safety and comfort. And finally, that last temptation was a temptation to impose Jesus's will through power, right? And we know that while Jesus certainly came to transform the world, he didn't do it through a display of earthly power. As you think about this story this week, about Jesus in the wilderness, about Jesus being tempted, I invite you to just think about your own journey of discipleship. How are you as a disciple growing more and more into the likeness of Christ? There's lots of good material in today's scripture for reflection, and I invite you to take some time this week and consider some of the questions that I've posed in this short video. Again, thank you for being with us, and I hope you'll tune in again next week. Blessings.